So, hello and welcome back to me having hair get into my mouth. Welcome back to another evening with Mr. Jules Verne, where we are, I think, about to commence our journey to the center of the earth, which means we have bid our ponies goodbye. But I found that guy, and I think he's actually supposed to be a halflinger pony and not an Icelandic horse, but he was kind of the closest thing I had to the horses that Axel and the professor were riding. So I figured I would pull him out and pop him up behind me. Anyway, how are you guys doing? It snowed here today, so I spent most of my day out shoveling my far too long driveway. I don't feel like the driveway is too long, except in the wintertime when I have to shovel it. Then I feel like it's far too long. The rest of the time I'm like, yeah, I don't want to be right up close to the road anyway. So that's what I did today. I hope you guys had a happy and productive day. Probably not as happy. Well, I don't feel like Axel is going to be very happy, but the professor is probably going to be happy. So we're going to jump back in and see if they can find the opening to the center of the earth, like the professor thinks, or whether they're just going to find an extinct volcanic crater like Axel seems to be hoping. And I mean, can we talk about poor Hans, the poor guy who has agreed to go with them instead of harvesting Ader down? Which I wonder if that's really how they get it. Somehow I feel like they probably shoot the ducks and pull the down out that way, but the way that it's described in here sounds more sustainable, so I'm a little more for it. Anyway, enough of all that. It is time for us to jump back into Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne with chapter 15 to start. Sneffels is 5,000 feet high. Its double cone is the end of a trimphatic stratum that stands out from the mountain system of the island. From our point of departure, we could see the two peaks boldly projected against the dark gray sky. I noticed an enormous cap of snow drawn down low upon the giant's brow. We walked in single file, led by the hunter, who ascended on narrow tracks where two could not have walked side by side. Conversation was therefore almost impossible. After we had passed the basaltic wall of the Stapi Fjord, we passed first over a grassy, fibrous, peaty soil left from the ancient vegetation of the peninsula. The vast quantity of this unused fuel would be sufficient to warm the whole population of Iceland for a century. This vast peat bog was up to 70 feet deep when measured from the bottom of certain ravines, and consisted of layers of carbonized vegetation residue alternating with thinner layers of turfaceous pumice. That's a new one to me. As a true nephew of Professor Lindenbrock, and in spite of my dismal prospects, I could not help observing with interest the mineralogical curiosities that lay around me in as vast a museum as I had ever seen, and I constructed for myself a complete geological account of Iceland. This most fascinating island has evidently been pushed up from the bottom of the sea at a comparatively recent date. Possibly it is still subject to gradual elevation. If this is so, its origin may well be attributed to subterranean fires. In that case, Sir Humphrey Davy's theory, Saknussem's document, and my uncle's claims would all just go up in smoke. This hypothesis led me to examine the appearance of the surface with more attention, and I soon arrived at a conclusion as to the nature of the forces which presided at its creation. Iceland. which is entirely devoid of all alluvial soil, is wholly composed of volcanic tuff, that is to say, an amalgamation of porous rocks and stones. Before the volcanoes erupted, it consisted of trop rocks slowly raised to sea level by action of central forces. The interior fire had not yet forced its way through. But at a later period, a wide chasm opened up diagonally from the southwest to the northeast of the island, through which the tympanic mass was gradually squeezed out. No violence accompanied this change. The quantity of ejected matter was vast, and the molten substances oozing out from the bowels of the earth slowly spread over extensive plains or in hillocky masses. In this period, feldspar, selenites, and porphyries appeared. But with the help of this outflow, the thickness of the crust of the island increased materially, and therefore also its powers of resistance. It may easily be conceived what vast quantities of elastic gases, what masses of molten matter accumulated beneath its solid surface, while no exit was practical after the cooling of the volcanic crust. Therefore, a moment came when the mechanical force of these gases was such that it lifted up the heavy crust and forced their way out through tall chimneys. Hence, the volcano created by pushing up the crust, and then the crater suddenly formed at the summit of the volcano. Eruptive phenomenon were succeeded by volcanic phenomenon. Through the newly created outlets, basalt residues were first ejected, of which the plain we were crossing offered the most wonderful specimens. We walked over heavy rocks of a dark gray color, which the cool down had shaped into hexagonal prisms. In the distance, we could see a large number of flattened cones that were once fire-spitting mouths. Then, obviously, after the basalt eruption had exhausted itself, the volcano, whose power increased through the excitation of the lesser craters, provided a passage for lava and tuff of ashes and scorsese, whose scattered streams I noticed on the mountainsides like abundant hair. This was the succession of phenomenon that produced Iceland, all deriving from the action of an interior fire. To suppose that the mass within was not still in a state of liquid incandescent was madness. And madness, above all, trying to reach the earth's center. So I felt a little bit comforted as we advanced to the assault of Snaefell's. The path grew more and more arduous, the ascent steeper and steeper. Loose fragments of rock tumbled beneath us, and utmost care was needed to avoid dangerous falls. Hans continued on as calmly as if he were on level ground. Sometimes he disappeared behind huge blocks, and we momentarily lost sight of him. Then a shrill whistle from his lips would indicate the direction we should go. Often he would stop, pick up a few bits of stone, stack them up into a recognizable shape, and thereby create landmarks to guide us on our way back. A wise precaution in itself, but as everything turned out, quite useless. 3 exhausting hours of walking had only brought us to the base of the mountain. There, Hans signaled us to stop, and a hasty breakfast was divided amongst us. My uncle swallowed 2 mouthfuls at a time to get it in faster, but whether he liked it or not, this was a rest as well as a breakfast hour, and he had to wait until it pleased our guide to move on. He gave the signal to depart after an hour. The 3 other Icelanders, just as taciturn as their comrade the hunter, did not say a single word and ate quietly. We were now beginning to scale the steep sides of Snaefell's. Through an optical illusion that occurs frequently in the mountains, its snowy summit appeared very close, and yet how many long hours it took to reach. And above all, what exhaustion! The rocks, not tied together by any connection of soil or plants, rolled away from under our feet and lost themselves in the plain with the speed of an avalanche. In some places, the flanks of the mountain formed an angle of at least 36 degrees with the horizon. It was utterly impossible to climb them, and we had to walk around these stony slopes, not without difficulty. We helped each other and used our sticks. I must admit that my uncle kept as close to me as he could. He never lost sight of me, and on many occasions his arm provided me with powerful support. He himself seemed to possess an innate sense of balance, for he never stumbled. The Icelanders, though they were heavily burdened, climbed with the agility of mountaineers. Judging by the distant appearance of the summit of Snaefell's, it seemed impossible to me to reach it on our side if the angle of the slopes did not diminish. Fortunately, after an hour of exhaustion and exertion, a kind of staircase appeared unexpectedly in the midst of the vast snow cover on the back of the volcano, which greatly helped our ascent. It originated from one of those torrents of stones thrown up by eruptions that are called Stina by the Icelanders. If this torrent had not been checked in its fall by the shape of the mountainsides, it would have fallen into the sea and formed many new islands. But such as it was, it served us well. The steepness increased, but these stone steps allowed us to climb up easily, and even so quickly that, having rested for a moment while my companions continued their ascent, I could see that they were already reduced to microscopic dimensions by the distance. At 7 in the evening, we had ascended the 2,000 steps of this grand staircase, and we had attained a bulge in the mountain, a kind of bed on which the cone proper of the crater rested. 3,200 feet below us stretched the sea. We had passed the limit of eternal snow, which is not very high up in Iceland because of the constant humidity of the climate. It was savagely cold. The wind was blowing powerfully. I was exhausted. The professor saw that my legs completely refused to do their duty, and in spite of all of his impatience, he decided to stop. He therefore spoke to the hunter, who shook his head, saying, "Ofanvor." "It seems we must go higher," said my uncle. Then he asked Hans for his reasoning. "Mistur," said the guide. "Ja, Mistur," said one of the Icelanders in a tone of alarm. "What does that word mean?" I uneasily asked. "Look," said my uncle. I looked down on the plain. An immense column of pulverized pumice, sand, and dust was rising up with a whirling circular motion like a waterspout. The wind was lashing it on that side of the Snaefell's where we were holding on. This dense veil hung across the sun, throwing a deep shadow over the mountains. If this tornado leaned over, it would sweep us up into its whirlwinds. This phenomenon, which is not infrequent when the wind blows from the glaciers, is called in Icelandic mistur. "Hasket, hasket," said our guide. Without knowing a word of Danish, I understood at once that we must follow Hans at top speed. He began to circle around the cone of the crater, but in a diagonal direction so as to facilitate our progress. Soon enough, the dust storm fell on the mountain, which quivered under the shock. The loose stones, caught in the blasts of wind, flew about in a hail as almost in an eruption. Fortunately, we were on the opposite side and sheltered from all harm. Without our guide's precaution, our torn-up bodies, shattered to smithereens, would have fallen down into the distance like the residue of an unknown meteor. Yet Hans did not think it prudent to spend the night on the sides of the cone. We continued a zigzagging climb. The 1,500 remaining feet took us 5 hours to clear. The circular route, the diagonals, and the counter marches must have measured at least 3 leagues. I could not go on. I succumbed to hunger and cold. The slightly thinner air was just not enough for my lungs. At last, at 11 o'clock, we reached the summit of Snaffels in the darkness, and before we went into the crater for shelter, I had time to observe the midnight sun at its lowest point, casting its pale beams on the island sleeping at my feet. And that is the end of the chapter, but we do have a picture. The picture says, "We could see the 2 peaks boldly projected against the dark gray sky." It's a very stark picture. And as always, I'm going to grab a drink and we will continue this in a moment. And now it's time to continue on with chapter 16 of Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Dinner was rapidly consumed, and the little company housed itself as best it could. The bed was hard, the shelter insubstantial, and our situation uncomfortable at 5,000 feet above sea level, yet I slept particularly well. It was one of the best nights I had ever had, and I did not even dream. The next morning we woke half frozen by the sharp, keen air, but in the light of the splendid sun. I rose from my granite bed and I went out to enjoy the magnificent spectacle that spread before my eyes. I stood on the summit of the southernmost peak of Snaffel. From there my view extended over the greatest part of the island. By an optical law, which obtains at all great heights, the shores seemed raised and the center depressed. It seemed as if one of Helbesmer's relief maps were lying at my feet. I could see deep valleys intersecting each other in every direction, precipices like wells and lakes reduced to ponds, rivers shortened into creeks. On my right, innumerable glaciers and multiple peaks succeeded each other, some plumed with feathery clouds of smoke. The undulations of these endless mountains, whose layers of snow made them look foamy, reminded me of the surface of a storming sea. When I looked westward, the ocean lay spread out majestically, like a continuation of these sheep-like summits. The eye could hardly tell where the earth ended and the waves began. I plunged into the famous ecstasy that high summits create in the mind, and this time without vertigo, for I was finally getting used to these sublime contemplations. My dazzled eyes were bathed in the bright flood of the solar rays. I was forgetting who I was, where I was, and I lived instead the life of elves and sylphs, imaginary inhabitants in Scandinavian mythology. I felt intoxicated by the pleasure of the heights without thinking of the abyss into which fate would soon plunge me. But I was brought back to reality by the arrival of Hans and the professor, who joined me on the summit. My uncle, turning west, pointed out to me a light stream, a mist, a semblance of land that dominated the horizon. "Greenland," he said. "Greenland?" I exclaimed. Yes, we're only 35 leagues from it, and during thaws, the polar bears come all the way to Iceland carried on top of icebergs, but that doesn't matter. Here we are, on the top of Snæfell's, and there are two peaks, one north and one south. Hans will tell us the name of the one on which we're standing. The question being asked, Hans replied, Scartaris. My uncle shot a triumphant glance at me. To the crater, he exclaimed. The crater of Snæfell's resembled an inverted cone whose opening might have been half a league in diameter. Its depth appeared to be about 2,000 feet. Imagine the aspect of such a container when it filled with thunder and flame. The bottom of the funnel was about 250 feet in circumference, so that its rather gentle slopes allowed its lower brim to be reached without any difficulty. Involuntarily, I compared the whole crater to an enormous hollow grenade launcher, and this comparison frightened me. What madness, I thought, to go down into a grenade launcher when it might be loaded and can go off at the slightest impact. But there was no way out. Hans resumed the lead with an air of indifference, and I followed without a word. In order to make the descent easier, Hans wound his way down the cone on a spiraling path. We had to walk amongst eruptive rocks, some of which, shaken out of their sockets, fell bouncing down into the abyss. The fall gave rise to surprisingly loud echoing. In certain parts of the cone, there were glaciers. Here Hans advanced only with extreme caution, sounding his way with his iron-tipped walking stick to discover any crevasses. At particularly dubious passages, it was necessary to tie ourselves to each other with a long cord, so that anyone who unexpectedly lost his foothold could be held up by his companions. This solidarity was prudent, but did not eliminate all the danger. Notwithstanding of the difficulties of the descent, on slopes unknown to the guide, the journey was still accomplished without any accidents, except for the loss of a coil of rope which escaped from the hands of Hans, and therefore took the shortest way to the bottom of the abyss. At midday, we had arrived. I raised my head, and I saw straight above me the upper aperture of the cone, framing a bit of sky, very small in circumference, but almost perfectly round. Just on the edge appeared the snowy peak of Scartaris, reaching to infinity. At the bottom of the crater, 3 chimneys opened up, through which Snæfell's, during its eruptions, had evacuated the lava and steam from the central furnace. Each of these chimneys was about 100 feet in diameter. They gaped before us, right in our path. I didn't have the courage to look down into them. But Professor Lindenbrock quickly examined all 3. He was panting, running from one to the other, gesticulating an utterly unintelligible string of words. Hans and his companions, sitting on pieces of lava, looked on. I could tell that they thought he was mad. Suddenly my uncle uttered a cry. I thought his foot must have slipped and that he had fallen down into one of the holes, but no. I saw him, arms outstretched, legs apart, standing in front of a granite rock that was placed in the center of the crater like a pedestal ready to receive a statue of Pluto. He stood with the posture of a stunned man, but one whose amazement was rapidly giving way to irrational joy. "Axel! Axel!" he exclaimed. "Come, come!" I ran. Hans and the Icelanders didn't even move. "Look," said the professor. And Sharing his astonishment, though not his joy, I read on the western face of the block, in runic characters half eaten away by time, this 1,000 times accursed name. Arne Sakmussen, said my uncle. Do you still doubt? I made no answer. I returned to my lava seat in consternation because this evidence had crushed me. How long I remained plunged into my reflections, I cannot tell. All I know is that when I raised my head again, I saw only my uncle and Hans at the bottom of the crater. The Icelanders had been dismissed, and they were now descending the outer slope of Snaefell's and returning to Stapi. Hans slept peaceably at the foot of a rock in a lava bed where he had made an improvised bower for himself. But my uncle was pacing around the bottom of the crater like a wild beast in a trapper's pit. I had neither the wish or the strength to rise, and following our guide's example, I went off into a painful slumber, thinking that I could hear noises or feel tremors in the sides of the mountain. Thus the first night in the bottom of the crater passed. The next morning, a gray, heavy, cloudy sky hung over the summit of the cone. I did not realize this so much because of the darkness in the chasm as because of the rage that seized my uncle. I understood his reasoning, and a glimmer of hope came back into my heart. Here's why. Of the 3 routes open to us, only one had been taken by Sakmussen. According to the Icelandic scholar, one had to identify it by the detail mentioned in the cryptogram, that the shadow of Scartaris would touch its edges during the last days of the month of June. The sharp peak might hence be considered the hand of a vast sundial, whose shadow on a given day would indicate the path to the middle of the earth. But if there was no sun, no shadow, consequently, no indicator. It was June 25th. If the sky stayed overcast for 6 days, we would have to postpone the observation for another year. I declined to describe Professor Lindenbrock's rage. The day passed and no shadow came to stretch along the bottom of the crater. Hans did not move from his spot, yet he must have been asking himself what we were waiting for, if he asked himself anything at all. My uncle did not say a single word to me. His gaze invariably turned to the sky, lost itself in the gray, misty hues. On the 26th, nothing yet. Rain mingled with snow fell all day long. Hans built a hut out of pieces of lava. I took certain pleasure in watching the thousands of improvised waterfalls along the sides of the cone, where every stone increased a deafening murmur. My uncle could no longer control himself. It was indeed enough to irritate a more patient man than him, because this really was a shipwreck before even leaving the port. But heaven always mixes great grief with great joy, and for Professor Lindenbrock there was satisfaction equal to his desperate troubles in store. The next day, the sky was again overcast, but on the 29th of June, the next to last day of the month, a change of weather came with the change of the moon. The sun poured a flood of light down the crater. Every hill, every stone, every roughness got its share of the luminous flow and instantly threw a shadow on the ground. Among them, that of Scartaris was outlined with a sharp edge and began to move slowly in the opposite direction from that of the radiant star. My uncle turned along with it. At noon, When it was its shortest, it softly brushed the edge of the middle chimney. "There it is! There it is!" shouted the professor. "To the center of the globe," he said in Danish. I looked over at Hans. "For it," he said quietly. "Forward," said my uncle. It was at 13 minutes past 1 o'clock. And that is the end of the chapter. But we did get another picture, and the picture is that of the mountain peak pointing the way to the center of the earth. Poor Axel. I feel so bad for him. I mean, he didn't want to go on this trip in the first place. He still doesn't want to go on this trip. And I think he was hoping he was going to have an ally in Hans, but Hans just doesn't seem to care as long as he's getting paid. I really enjoyed that. Honestly, it kind of just makes me want to go on a journey, although not to the center of the earth, because I do know that that is not possible. Thank you, as always, for listening. I hope that you enjoyed those 2 chapters. Leave me a thumbs up if you don't mind. It does always make me smile, and I will see you tomorrow.